Reginald Taft slid a single sheet of paper across the conference table and said, "We're adjusting your comp structure going forward, Vera. Think of it as a rebalancing." The paper had 3 numbers on it. My current base, a new base that was $22,000 lower, and a variable bonus tied to metrics he controlled. The room smelled like stale bagels and carpet cleaner. 2 HR representatives sat against the wall with the specific body language of people paid not to have opinions. Reggie leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, wearing the tan blazer he always wore when he wanted to look approachable while doing something irreversible. He was 36 years old. He had been VP of Compensation and People Strategy for 8 months. He had been hired by the new CHRO, who had been hired by the CFO, who played golf every other Saturday with Reggie's father. I looked at the paper. I looked at Reggie. Then I said, "I'll review this with my attorney." His jaw shifted in a way that told me he had not expected those words in that order. He should have. If you've ever discovered that loyalty is apparently a one-directional transaction in corporate America, like and subscribe. This one ends in a place Reggie Taft will spend a long time explaining to people he respects. My name was Vera Colston. I was 47. And for 14 years, I had been the reason Halloran Group's compensation data was worth anything at all. Halloran Group was a privately held professional employer organization based in Charlotte, North Carolina. We were the back-office infrastructure for about 340 small and mid-sized employers across 9 southeastern states. Payroll processing, benefits administration, multi-state tax compliance, workers' comp coordination, ACA reporting, state wage and hour monitoring, and a dozen adjacent services that small businesses never want to think about until they are absolutely forced to. The product we actually sold was compliance certainty. The thing we were actually selling was the confidence that none of our clients would wake up to an IRS penalty, a wage claim, or a Department of Labor audit that they hadn't been warned about 3 months in advance. My title was Director of Compensation Analytics and Regulatory Intelligence. The job description made it sound like I built dashboards. That was like saying a cardiologist takes blood pressure. I joined Halloran when the company was 140 people and ran their payroll data out of 2 connected access databases that had been lovingly, disastrously duct-taped together by a bookkeeper who had since retired to Tennessee. My predecessor had managed compensation data the way you manage a very nervous aquarium. One unusual movement and everything died. Nothing was integrated. Nothing was validated. Nothing could be audited because the audit trail assumed you had already agreed not to look too hard. My first year, I mapped every salary band, every job code, every bonus schedule, every deferred comp structure, every geographic differential, and every exception in the building. Not because anyone asked me to, because without the map, everything downstream was fiction. Over the next 5 years, I built what I called the Halloran Pay Architecture Framework, or HBF. This was not a PowerPoint deck. It was a live operational system, maintained in a proprietary structured database I designed and administered, that tracked every compensation element across the entire organization, cross-referenced to job classification, performance tier, tenure band, location, department, and 14 other variables. HBF also served as the compliance backbone for our external pay equity reporting. That part matters. That is the part Reggie Taft had not fully read. Because Halloran was not just an employer of 340 people. It was a PO managing compensation and HR infrastructure for roughly 6,400 co-employees across client companies. That meant we were technically a co-employer under federal and most state definitions, which meant our pay equity exposure was not confined to our own headcount. It extended across a portion of our client base depending on which compliance standards applied. Starting in year 7, I began filing voluntary pay equity disclosures with the North Carolina Human Relations Commission under a pilot program the commission ran for large professional employer organizations. I did this because Halloran's general counsel at the time, a careful woman named Patricia Howe, and I agreed that voluntary early disclosure was a defensible strategy in a regulatory environment that was clearly tightening. The commission assigned us a designated reporting entity number. My name, my professional credential, and my contact information were the registered points of contact on that designation. Not the company's contact. Not HR's contact. Mine. Named. Verified. On file with the state agency. Every year, I submitted an updated pay equity analysis. Every year, I signed the attestation as the qualified compensation professional responsible for the methodology and accuracy of the submission. That process was called the Annual Compensation Equity Attestation Submission. HPF generated the data. I certified the accuracy. The commission held the record. If my attestation ever lapsed, if I were no longer employed in good standing in the attesting role, or if I filed a formal methodology withdrawal, the Commission's regulations required Halloran to suspend its voluntary reporter status and undergo a mandatory third-party audit before re-enrollment. That audit took between 6 and 14 months. During a mandatory audit, the Commission was permitted to request Halloran's full internal compensation database, employee-level pay history, job classification records, and exception documentation going back 4 years. For years. I had built HPF. I knew exactly what 4 years of honest data inside it would show. More on that in a moment. I also want to tell you what Halloran looked like before Reggie arrived, because context is the difference between a story and an explanation. Under our previous CHRO, Linda Vargas, the company ran compensation reviews annually in the first quarter. Linda was methodical and impatient with excuses, the kind of executive who believed in standards partly from principle and partly because she had seen what happened when they slipped. She and I had built a functioning pay equity review calendar. We ran analysis twice a year, flagged compression and inequity issues, and addressed them before they became claim-sized. It was not perfect. No system is. But it was honest. The legal team trusted HBF because they could use it to answer hard questions. External auditors respected it because its documentation was consistent and reproducible. We had passed 3 IRS Affordable Care Act compliance reviews and 2 voluntary commission audits without a material finding. I had also, in year 11, identified a systematic pay gap between the company's female technical staff and male staff in equivalent job codes. I brought it to Linda. She brought it to the CFO. They corrected it properly over 3 pay cycles with documented remediation records in HBF. That was how it was supposed to work. Then Linda retired. The board hired a CFO-preferred CHRO named Garrett Wells, who had the professional philosophy of someone who believed HR existed to protect the company from employees rather than align the two. Garrett's first hire was Reginald Taft. Reggie was 36, held an MBA from a school he mentioned in conversation more often than necessary, and dressed in blazers that cost too much for the impression they made. He was not a bad person in the theatrical sense. He was the more dangerous kind. He was confident, affable, and wrong at high speed. He moved fast in every direction and checked depth only when something went visibly wrong. He also had 0 formal compensation analytics background, a fact he compensated for, if I may use the word, by treating everything he did not understand as something that could be simplified. His first full staff meeting, he described HPF as our internal comp spreadsheet. I looked at the table. He then said he wanted to streamline the equity reporting process to reduce the administrative burden and free up capacity. The room was quiet the way rooms get when 14 people know something is wrong and nobody wants to hold it first. I said, there are commission filings attached to that process. He said, right, we'll loop in legal. He did not loop in legal. What he did instead, over the next 6 months, was begin a compensation restructuring initiative under the banner of performance-aligned pay modernization. The idea, such as it was, looked like this: reduce fixed base salaries, increase variable components tied to manager-approved performance scores, and realign the pay bands for several technical and analytical roles. That last phrase, realign the pay bands. I ran the analysis before he announced anything publicly. What I found was not subtle. The realignment reduced base salary for 11 of the 14 roles that were disproportionately held by women in the technical and analytical track. It increased base salary for 7 roles in operations and business development that were disproportionately held by men. The variable bonus component now depended entirely on manager scoring, which had no calibration standard and no equity audit. I put it in a memo. 14 pages. Methodology transparent. I sent it to Reggie, Garrett, Patricia's replacement in legal, and our CFO. Reggie responded 9 days later with a meeting invitation titled Clarifying Vera's Questions. The meeting was him, HR, and a junior employment attorney named Dale who was earnest and inexperienced in the particular way of people who have read the law but not yet encountered the kind of executive who treats it as a suggestion. Reggie told me the analysis was a bit alarmist and that the variable pay model would even out over time with strong performance. He said that sentence with the calm of a man who had never been on the wrong end of a pay decision in his life. I said, even out how specifically? He said, that's part of what performance-aligned pay solves for. Dale wrote something down. I did not know what, but I hoped it was that. Over the following 3 months, 3 women on my team had their pay restructured. My senior analyst, Joanna Marsh, who had been at Halloran for 9 years and held a national compensation certification, saw her base cut by $18,400 and her new variable component tied to a quota metric that had been created without her input. My data governance lead, Sandra Osei, had her title reclassified from senior to associate, cutting her out of the senior compensation band entirely, a move that triggered a $14,200 base reduction. A third analyst, Keely Drummond, who had built the benefits reconciliation module inside HPF from scratch, was placed on a performance improvement plan based on manager feedback that Keely had never received in her previous 7 years of reviews. I watched all 3 of them process this information with the specific expression of adults realizing that fair and employed are not the same condition. I also kept running the data. Over 6 months, HPF showed me something that would have been uncomfortable in any era and was genuinely dangerous in this one. The average base salary gap between male and female employees in equivalent job codes at Halloran, already narrow before Reggie's realignment, had widened by $16,800 at the median. For senior technical staff, the gap was $23,100. For manager-level women in analytical roles, it was $29,400. Not because men had been given raises. Because women had been given restructurings. I documented all of it inside HBF with timestamps, classification notes, and data provenance records, the way I had always documented everything. Then Reggie called me into the rebalancing meeting. The word rebalancing. As though my salary were a portfolio in a volatile market rather than an agreement between an adult and her employer. He slid the paper across. My base, down $22,000. Variable component controlled by his scoring. Realignment, language in the body of the document. One line near the bottom, phrased politely, saying that acceptance of the new structure constituted agreement with the company's compensation methodology. I was supposed to sign it. That last sentence mattered to him in a specific way I understood immediately. If I signed, I had implicitly endorsed the methodology. The methodology that was now on file with my name attached to an annual commission attestation. The methodology HPF had quietly, consistently documented was inequitable. He thought he was asking me to accept a pay cut. What he didn't know was he was asking me to co-sign a disclosure I would have to certify to the state within 4 months. I said, I'll review this with my attorney. He said, there's really not a lot to review. I picked up the paper, folded it once, put it in my bag, and said, then that should go quickly. I walked to the elevator, pressed the lobby button, and rode down to the parking garage without speaking to anyone. In my car, in the dark of the garage, with the engine off, I sat for about 90 seconds. Not to compose myself. I was composed. I was calculating the distance between what Reggie thought he had just done and what he had actually done. That distance was considerable. That evening, I called my attorney, a labor and employment specialist named Rita Cohn, who had that particular vocal register that signals someone has seen every version of this before and is still interested in getting it right. I laid out the timeline, the memo, the 3 women, the pay gap data, the restructuring, the meeting, the paper. Rita said, and you're the named attestation contact with the commission. Yes. When is the next filing? 14 weeks. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, do not sign anything. Do not withdraw anything. Do not skip the filing deadline. I know. The commission filing is protected activity. I know that too. A pause. Vera. Yes. Do you have a copy of the full HBF data pull? I have 3. She actually laughed at that. Short and genuine. Good, she said. Let me look at what we're working with. The following weekend, I exported a complete HBF archive. Not in a flash drive hidden under the desk sense. In a documented, time-stamped, legally defensible sense. Rita had confirmed that as the systems architect and the attesting officer, my professional access to the data I had personally built and certified for state compliance purposes was clean. The export contained 14 years of compensation records. Every job code, every salary band, every adjustment, every exception, every reclassification, every performance rating attached to a pay action, every bonus decision, every remediation record from the gap correction 3 years earlier, every note I had entered about methodology, data provenance, and audit review. It also contained a dataset I had been quietly building over the previous 6 months. I called it the Realignment Impact Record. It mapped every compensation action taken under Reggie's performance-aligned pay modernization against gender, job code, tenure band, and performance rating. Not a narrative. Not an opinion. Just the documented comparison of who got what, when, and why, according to the actual records in the system. The Realignment Impact Record was 218 rows. Of the 218 compensation actions, 144 were pay reductions or reclassifications. Of those 144 actions, 112 applied to women. Of those 112, 94 were in roles where equivalent male employees received increases or no change. I printed that table. I put it in a folder. I put the folder in my filing cabinet. Then I made dinner. Roasted vegetables and rice, because it was a Sunday and Sundays deserved the basic kind of comfort. My cat, Odessa, sat on the kitchen counter watching me with the blank philosophical stare of a creature who had never once been restructured. I ate at the table. Then I watched a television program about competitive furniture restoration, which turned out to be more emotionally engaging than the premise suggested. I slept at 10:30 p.m. entirely without difficulty. The following Friday, 8 days after Reggie's meeting, I submitted the annual compensation equity attestation filing to the NC Human Relations Commission. I submitted it on time. Completely. Honestly. With the full HBF dataset, the methodology documentation, and my attestation signature. The filing reflected what the data actually showed. I did not editorialize. I did not attach a letter. I did not flag it to the Commission's compliance team. I simply filed what was true. What was true was that Halloran's compensation equity position had deteriorated significantly over the prior year, with documented widening of gender-based pay gaps in 9 of 14 analyzed job code categories, a material increase in median pay differential between male and female employees in equivalent roles, and a reduction in remediation activity compared to prior periods. All of that was drawn directly from HBF. All of it was my professional responsibility to disclose. All of it was now in the Commission's possession. I also sent a single email to Rita that night. Filed. She replied, "Good. Don't touch anything else. Let them move first." I said, "I am very comfortable with patience." She said, "I know. That's why this will work." I did not sign Reggie's rebalancing paper. Monday morning came. Reggie's assistant called at 9:17 to ask if I had reviewed the document. I said I was reviewing it with counsel. She said he was hoping to close this out today. I said I understand. That was the most useful sentence in the English language for situations like that. Nothing happened on Monday. On Tuesday, Reggie called me directly. "Vera, look, we need to move on this. The new pay structure goes live at the end of the month and I need all director level accepts logged." I said, "I'm still in review." He said, "Is there a concern I can address?" I said, "Rita Cohn is my counsel. You're welcome to have Dale reach out to her." Silence. Then, "That seems like a lot for a standard comp adjustment." "It might be." Silence again. Then he said, "Okay," and hung up. That was Tuesday. Wednesday was when the commission sent the acknowledgement. Not to me. To Halloran's registered compliance email, which forwarded to legal, which forwarded to the new general counsel. A man named Victor Haynes, who was 3 months in the role and had not yet been initiated into the particular joy of institutional compliance surprises. The acknowledgement thanked Halloran for the timely voluntary submission and noted that the Commission's equity analysis team would be reviewing the filing in detail given the year-over-year change in reported metrics and would be in contact within 45 days. Victor forwarded it to Garrett with the message, "What is this?" Garrett forwarded it to Reggie with the message, "Did you know about this?" Reggie forwarded it to me with the message, "Can you explain what you filed?" I forwarded all 3 to Rita. She replied, 15 minutes. Give them nothing. That was Wednesday. Thursday was the first phone call that contained real fear. Reggie called at 11:42 a.m. "The commission is reviewing a filing you submitted. I need you to clarify whether you disclosed internal metrics without management authorization." I said, "The commission filing is part of my designated reporting responsibility under the voluntary disclosure program." He said, "But you didn't run this through legal." I said, "The filing protocol designates me as the responsible attesting officer. It does not require management sign-off on factual compensation data." He said, "I'm not sure that's." I said, "Rita is available if Victor would like to discuss the regulatory structure." He stopped. Then, "Victor is already on it." Good. The call lasted 4 more minutes of him searching for a sentence that would make the commission filing retroactively not exist. He did not find one because it does not exist in English. Victor called Rita directly at 1:04 p.m. Rita told me later it was a short call. He asked whether the filing had been unauthorized. She explained the regulatory framework calmly, referenced the commission registration documents with my name on them, and pointed out that preventing or retaliating against a properly filed compensation equity disclosure would be, to put it gently, not a position Halloran's outside counsel would enjoy defending. Victor apparently sat very quietly for a while after that. That was Thursday. Friday, Reggie stopped walking past my office door. That was almost poetic. He had walked past it many times in 8 months, usually with his hands in his pockets and the casual drift of a man who felt entitled to all space. That Friday, he took a different hall route. The distance between confidence and awareness is sometimes measured in footsteps. Monday, I arrived to an email from Garrett summoning me to a meeting that afternoon. Garrett Wells, Victor Haynes, Reggie, and a woman from the outside firm who had introduced herself in a previous legal consultation as a senior employment attorney named Carla Branch. Carla Branch's presence was the tell. Carla was the kind of attorney companies hire when they realize the internal team is already compromised. I brought Rita. The meeting room smelled like dry air and recycled anxiety. The afternoon light came through Venetian blinds in flat parallel strips. Someone had placed a legal pad and 2 branded pens at each seat, which is what people do when they want a meeting to feel formal, but do not want to seem threatening. It never works. Garrett opened. He thanked me for coming, which felt like being thanked by turbulence. Then he said, "Vera, there are some concerns about the data submitted to the commission." I said, "What concerns?" He looked at Carla. Carla said, "The submission appears to have included internal compensation data that may be subject to confidentiality protections and may not have represented an accurate picture of the company's full pay equity posture." May not have represented was a fascinating phrase. I said, "The submission was generated directly from HPF, which is the system of record for compensation data that I designed and maintain. The methodology is consistent with the 4 prior filings I submitted under the same protocol." Carla said, "The concern is whether the year-over-year change in metrics accurately reflects the company's. The data reflects the compensation actions recorded in HPF," I said. "If the commission finds the methodology inconsistent, they'll request clarification." Reggie said, "You should have come to me before filing." That was the worst sentence he had said in the room. Worse than the rebalancing one. Rita said, "Under the commission's voluntary disclosure registration, the named attesting officer files independently. That is the entire structure of the program. Management sign-off on factual disclosure would actually compromise the integrity of the filing." Victor was writing something on the legal pad. Carla tried again. We'd like you to consider submitting a corrected or supplemental filing that provides additional context. I looked at her, then at Reggie, then at Garrett. A corrected filing requires that the original filing contained errors, I said. It did not. If the company believes the data is wrong, I'm available to walk through the methodology with the commission directly. Garrett said, Vera, we're all on the same team here. That sentence is a specific kind of insult. The kind reserved for moments when someone wants you to act like the team is mutual and the evidence is not in the room. I said, I know which team I'm on. Then Rita laid it out. She cited the exact commission regulation protecting the attesting officer. She cited the retaliation clause. She pointed to the original paper Reggie had slid across the table 2 weeks earlier and noted that timing of a compensation reduction initiated while the named attesting officer was in the process of preparing a filing that reflected negatively on the company's pay equity position would be difficult to describe charitably to the commission's enforcement division. She paused for 2 seconds. Then she said, my client has documentation of the gender-based compensation disparities reflected in the filing. She is prepared to cooperate fully with the commission's analysis. We are not here to escalate, but we are not here to correct accurate data. Reggie said, this is completely disproportionate. Carla touched his arm once, which was her professional way of saying stop speaking. Victor looked at Rita. What does your client want? He said. He was the first adult in the room to ask that. Rita looked at me. I looked at Victor. I want the commission's process to complete without interference, I said. I want the compensation actions that created the documented gap to be reviewed and remediated properly. I want Joanna Marsh, Sandra Osei, and Keely Drummond's positions and pay to be corrected. And I want the performance improvement plan Keely is currently on to be withdrawn and expunged. Garrett said, that's a significant list. I said, it's a proportionate one. Reggie said, we cannot let an analyst run the compensation strategy. That sentence landed in the room and produced a specific quiet. Carla said, Reggie. He stopped. Victor looked at his legal pad again. After a recess that lasted 19 minutes, we came to terms. Not cheerfully, not fully, but we came to them. The remediation for Joanna, Sandra, and Keely was agreed in writing. Salary restoration plus arrears for 6 months. Keely's PIP expunged. Sandra's reclassification reversed. Joanna returned to her original role mapping with back adjustment. My rebalancing was withdrawn. My compensation remained as previously structured with an adjustment for the year I had not received a review due to Reggie's restructuring moratorium on certain director-level roles. Garrett reluctantly agreed to let the commission process run without internal interference. Carla drafted a memo that committed to a third-party compensation audit within 90 days. And the realignment impact record, all 218 rows of it, was submitted to the commission as a supplemental exhibit because Rita correctly identified it as responsive to their analysis request. That last part was not agreed to cheerfully, but it was agreed to. Because the alternative was a commission enforcement referral, a mandatory audit, and whatever the commission's analysis team made of 14 years of HPF data in a formal proceeding. Nobody wanted that version. The permanent damage was quieter than the boardroom, the way lasting consequences usually are. The third-party pay equity audit Carla's memo required was completed 4 months later by a firm called Meridian HR Consulting. They had access to HPF. They had access to the realignment impact record. They had access to 6 months of Reggie's compensation actions. Their report identified a statistically significant pattern of gender-based pay disparity across 11 job code categories. Remediation cost, $4.1 million in adjusted back pay and salary corrections. Legal and consulting fees Halloran paid in connection with the commission process, $1.3 million. Reggie's performance-aligned pay modernization had been designed, publicly, to save $2.4 million annually in base salary costs. His initiative cost the company $5.4 million to clean up. He had tried to replace honest compensation review with a variable model he controlled. What that cost was 2.25 times the savings he projected, plus the full audit he was supposed to prevent. plus the commission review that produced a formal compliance guidance letter that sat in Halloran's regulatory file and would be there for every future M&A due diligence that competent people ran. That last part does not show up on a P&L. It shows up when a potential acquirer pulls the file and asks why the commission issued a corrective guidance to the company 2 years ago. And then someone has to explain Reggie. Garrett Wells stepped down 9 months later to pursue what the company called external opportunities. The press release used the phrase mutual agreement, which is corporate for the board had a very direct conversation. Reggie left 6 weeks after Garrett. His LinkedIn announced he was transitioning to a strategic advisory capacity, which is the professional equivalent of not being able to say what actually happened. Keely Drummond was promoted to senior compensation analyst and took over the HPF governance documentation project I had designed as a knowledge transfer asset before I left. Joanna Marsh became the director of my former team. Sandra Osei was reclassified back to senior, and given the retention equity she should have received 2 years earlier. They thought the 3 of them were just names on a restructuring slide. What they didn't know is they were adults who had been doing the real work the whole time and were going to keep doing it after everyone else moved on. As for me, I accepted a role 6 months after the commission resolution as Chief People Analytics Officer at a financial services company in Raleigh. Real title, real authority, board-level reporting for compensation governance, pay equity strategy, and regulatory intelligence. Salary that reflected what I had actually been doing for 14 years. My new team was small and very good. 3 analysts who liked data for its own sake, 1 regulatory specialist who laughed at the same jokes I did, and a systems engineer who looked at PAF's architecture when I described it and said, "You built this yourself?" The way people say it when they mean that differently than they realize. I built a new version there. Cleaner. Faster. With better access controls and a succession plan built in from day one, because one of the things you learn from doing everything alone is what happens when the person who knows everything leaves unexpectedly. My cat Odessa came with me to the new apartment in Raleigh. The light was better. The parking was worse. The coffee shop 2 blocks from the office had a back corner table I claimed on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and eventually the staff stopped asking what I wanted because a woman who orders the same thing 40 times becomes a regular rather than a customer. Small, specific pleasures. The kind that accumulate. About 8 months into the new role, I received a LinkedIn notification that a former Halloran executive had viewed my profile. Not Reggie. Victor Haynes. The attorney who had been the only adult in that meeting room. 2 weeks later, he sent a message. "Vera, I'd like to speak with you when you have time. Working on some governance structure updates. Think your perspective would be valuable." I held the message for a day. Then I replied, "Happy to speak, Victor. Tuesday works." He had asked the right question in that room. It cost him some early months of difficulty, but ultimately earned him the kind of institutional trust that survives executive turnover. People who ask the right question at the right time tend to be worth continuing to know. One more thing. A few months after I settled into the new role, a compensation analytics blog I respected published a piece about pay equity enforcement trends in the southeastern United States, specifically the increasing use of voluntary reporting programs as a mechanism for identifying systematic compensation problems that internal oversight had failed to catch. The writer cited a case in which a company's own named attestation officer submitted an accurate filing that diverged sharply from management's internal narrative, triggering an audit that resulted in $4.1 million in remediation. No company name, but the detail was specific. I read the paragraph twice. Then I set my phone down on my desk, looked out at the Raleigh afternoon, and went back to the system design I had been working on. Because that was always the part that mattered most to me. Not the aftermath. The architecture. Pay equity is not a political idea. It is a data management problem. You either build a system that records reality honestly and forces the organization to respond to it, or you build a system that records what management finds convenient and hope no one files an accurate document with the right agency. I built the honest kind. Reggie found that inconvenient. The commission found it useful. The 3 women on my team found it, eventually, fair. And I found it satisfying in the way structural honesty is always satisfying. Not loud. Not triumphant. Just correct. They thought HPF was a spreadsheet. What they didn't know was it was a mirror, and they had spent 6 months standing in front of it making decisions they would eventually have to explain. If you have ever watched someone try to rebalance reality because accountability was more expensive than they budgeted, like and subscribe. And drop a comment telling me where you would have walked away and where you would have stayed. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is file the accurate document and let the system do what systems do when honest data reaches the right desk. That is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is just the kind of patient precision that wins every time, as long as you build the right thing and document it right, and keep the 3 copies in the right places. As for me, I took the better title, the better team, and Odessa. They took the audit. I think we both got what we built.